She was shivering under a collapsed shed, collecting rainwater in an old boot, alone, silent, and unseen. Most people passed her by without a second glance, but one man, a rancher who hadn't spoken much since his wife died, did something different. He didn't ask who she was, he just brought a kettle and built a fire. What happened next will stay with you. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap that like button. The story you're about to hear is a quiet reminder that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can change two lives forever. The girl moved silently across the muddy ground, careful not to make noise as she placed the old leather boot beneath the broken corner of a rain gutter. The boot, cracked and worn at the seams, had belonged to someone else long ago, someone she didn't talk about anymore. Drops of rain slid down the rusty tin roof and splashed into the boot with soft, steady rhythm. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She crouched beside it, thin arms wrapped around her knees, a wool blanket torn and frayed draped over her shoulders. Her long black hair clung to her cheeks, soaked by the drizzle that had crept in all afternoon. The makeshift shelter where she hid was nothing more than a collapsed wooden shed, on the far edge of the land between a dry creek bed and a wire fence no one bothered to fix. There were no doors, no locks, only silence and the moaning wind through the trees. She had been alone for weeks now, counting days by watching how many times the moon disappeared behind the mountains. She didn't expect kindness, not anymore. People had shown her what they were capable of. That's why she stayed in the shadows. That's why she spoke to no one. Out in the distance, behind the line of mesquite trees and brush, a figure on a horse paused at the crest of the hill. The man didn't move, didn't call out, just watched. His name was Elijah Knox. Everyone in town called him the Lonely Rancher, though no one ever asked him if he felt lonely. He wasn't the type to correct them. Elijah had seen her twice before, once near the highway, crouched behind a dumpster, another time at the gas station when she tried to buy a granola bar with coins that didn't add up. He said nothing, just walked past, but today, watching her with that boot, waiting for rain like it was gold, he felt something press against his chest, something that reminded him of when his wife was sick and wouldn't ask for help, that quiet, stubborn pain. He turned the horse around and rode back to his ranch. That night, as the rain deepened, he didn't sleep. He stared at the kettle on his stove, old but still working, and made a decision. The next morning, just after dawn, she was still there, still crouched by the boot. When she looked up, startled by footsteps, he didn't say anything. He just knelt down, placed a kettle on the ground in front of her, and set 2 stones beside it. Then he opened a metal tin and began to build a tiny fire. No words, no questions, just warmth, just a gesture. The girl didn't speak, she didn't run either. She sat, wide-eyed, watching the smoke rise. And for the first time in a long time, someone had brought her something without taking something first. Elijah returned the next morning with an old tin cup and a small bag of dry beans wrapped in cloth. He walked slowly, careful not to step too close, and set them down near the edge of the girl's shelter. Then he sat on a nearby log, close enough to be seen but far enough to let her choose the distance. He didn't speak, he didn't look at her directly. He just stared at the steam rising from the kettle they had used the day before, which now sat cold and empty beside her. The girl hadn't moved much since the night before. She had watched him leave, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. She didn't know what to expect from him. No one had ever returned before. Most people gave her looks of disgust or suspicion. A few had yelled, one had tried to grab her. But this man just left things behind and waited without a word. She didn't know what to make of that. Elijah wasn't a man of many words, and he liked it that way. His ranch was 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, and he had gone entire seasons speaking only to his horses. Since his wife passed 4 years earlier, he had let the house fall into quiet disrepair. Dishes piled up, weeds grew in the garden, the barn leaned a little more each year. Still, he woke every day at dawn, made coffee, fed the animals, and fixed what he could. It wasn't much of a life, but it was his. When he first saw the girl a few weeks back, she reminded him of a stray coyote, skinny, sharp-eyed, and always on the move. But when he watched her crouched in the rain, collecting water in a boot, something inside him shifted. He saw in her something he didn't know he had room for anymore, a need that wasn't his but felt familiar. So now he came and he left things, a spoon one day, a folded rag the next. He never asked her name, never offered his. She never answered anyway, but her silence didn't scare him. He understood silence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with streaks of fire, Elijah stood to leave again. He glanced back at her for the briefest moment and saw her hands cupped around the tin cup he had brought. She hadn't drunk anything, but she held it close to her chest like it meant something. That was enough for him. That night at his ranch, Elijah opened the back room of his house for the first time in years. It had been his wife's sewing room. Dust covered everything, but the walls still smelled like cedar and lavender. He stood in the doorway a long while before stepping inside. The next morning he returned not just with food, but with a folded piece of clothing, a wool sweater, gently worn but warm. He didn't expect her to take it, but she did. She still hadn't said a word, but now, when he arrived, she no longer flinched. And in Elijah's quiet world, that felt like something close to joy. The third week came with biting wind and gray skies that stretched endlessly over the flat New Mexico plains. The girl pulled the wool sweater tight around her frame as she watched clouds move slowly overhead. The kettle, now her most treasured possession, sat on the stones Elijah had set. Every morning she'd pour a little rainwater into it and wait for warmth, wait for him. Elijah arrived just after sunrise, the smell of brewed coffee clinging to his clothes. He carried a metal tin, a box of matches, and half a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper. His boots crunched softly over the dried leaves as he walked, slow and steady, like always. When he reached the usual spot, he crouched low and began to build the fire again, methodical, patient. He didn't speak, and neither did she. But when he poured the water and handed her the cup, something changed. Her hands, always hesitant, reached out with less caution this time. The cup trembled slightly in her grasp, not from fear, but from cold. She sipped slowly. Elijah sat beside the fire, elbows resting on his knees, staring into the flames like he was searching for something he'd lost years ago. Minutes passed, maybe longer, before she whispered, "What's your name?" He turned, caught off guard. Her voice was small, barely above the wind, but it was the first sound she'd made in his presence. It struck him like a bell. "Elijah," he answered, "and you?" She hesitated, then looked down at the steam rising from the cup. "Tessa." He repeated it gently, like tasting a word he hadn't spoken in years. "Tessa." The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It felt warm, like something had shifted ever so slightly in both of them. She didn't ask more, he didn't press, but that small exchange was enough to open something, just enough to let light in. That afternoon, Elijah walked her through how to keep the fire alive longer. He showed her how to shape the stones so the wind wouldn't steal the heat, how to use dry grass and not overfeed the flames. Tessa listened intently, nodding now and then. For the first time, she looked like a student, and he, for the first time in decades, felt like a teacher. Before he left that day, he stood and looked down at her. "I'll be back in the morning." Tessa nodded once. When he disappeared over the hill, she stayed beside the fire long after the embers faded. The cup in her hands still held a little warmth, and somewhere deep inside her chest, something unfamiliar stirred. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the beginning of it. The morning air was colder now. Autumn had slipped in quietly, leaving the ground crisp and the sky sharper. Tessa woke before the sun, her breath visible in the chill. She pulled the wool sweater close and stepped outside the shelter. The boot was nearly full with rainwater from the night, and the kettle sat beside it, waiting like always. She lit the fire by herself for the first time. Elijah arrived a little later than usual. When he saw the flames already crackling and the kettle gently steaming, he stopped mid-step. A slow smile crossed his face, not wide or loud, but quiet, proud. He didn't say anything as he approached. He just sat down beside her like it had always been that way. That morning, instead of bringing food, he left a small folded cloth pouch next to her. Inside were simple things, bandages, a tiny bar of soap, a cracked mirror. She opened it slowly, glancing at him out of the corner of her eye. He sipped his coffee and stared into the fire, pretending not to notice, but he noticed everything. Over the next few days, he brought other small gifts, a roll of socks, a tin of beans, a dog-eared book about horses. Each time he left it gently, never asking for anything, never pushing too hard, and each time Tessa accepted it with a little more ease. She began to wait for him. She wouldn't admit it even to herself, but she did. She started smoothing her hair before he came, sitting up straighter, tidying the blanket around the shelter. Something about his presence made her feel visible again, not judged, not stared at, just seen. One afternoon, as golden light spilled through the trees, Elijah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded note. He handed it to her wordlessly. Inside was a short message, written in neat, careful handwriting. "You don't owe anyone your silence." Tessa read it 3 times, then she folded it and tucked it into the sleeve of her sweater like it was something sacred. That evening, when he stood to leave, she spoke again. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice rough, like it hadn't been used in too long. Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the fading sun, then back at her. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it," he said, "and I never forgot." Tessa didn't say anything else, but she didn't look away. As he disappeared down the hill, the firelight danced in her eyes. She sat alone again, but for the first time, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt accompanied even in his absence. And that, in her world, was more valuable than warmth or food. It was the start of something she thought she'd never feel again. Hope. The storm rolled in faster than anyone expected. By mid-afternoon, heavy clouds swept across the horizon, and by dusk, the first drops of cold rain fell hard against the dirt. The temperature dropped sharply. Tessa curled deeper into the blanket, her hands clutching the kettle close to her chest. The fire wouldn't stay lit. The wind was too strong, too wet. She had no dry wood left. The roof of the broken shed dripped steadily, and the old boot, usually her quiet water collector, tipped over in the wind and spilled everything it held. She didn't cry. She had learned long ago that crying never changed anything. But she sat in the dark, soaked and shivering, her eyes scanning the distance. She wasn't expecting him tonight, not with the storm, but she still hoped. Elijah had felt the storm too. He stood on his porch, rain battering the tin roof, thunder groaning in the distance. His gut twisted with unease. Something told him not to wait for morning. He grabbed his coat, his hat, and a thick wool jacket from the closet. As he saddled his horse, the barn doors banged behind him in the wind. He rode fast, the rain needling into his face, the ground soft and treacherous underfoot. When he reached the girl's shelter, his heart sank. She was there, barely visible in the flicker of lightning, curled up in the wet dirt, her lips pale, her sweater soaked through. The fire pit was a puddle. Her fingers trembled as she tried to shield the kettle with her body. "Tessa," he called softly. She looked up, eyes wide, stunned to see him. She tried to sit up, but her strength had slipped. Without asking, Elijah knelt beside her and wrapped the thick jacket around her shoulders. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled her gently into his arms, not tight, not forceful, just enough to share his warmth. "You're freezing," he muttered. "You should have left this place." She whispered through chattering teeth, didn't know where else to go. Elijah didn't respond. He just held her until the shaking slowed. Then he built a fire again, this time using the dry kindling he brought wrapped in oilcloth, and lit it under a tree where the rain couldn't reach. He set the kettle above the flames and waited until steam rose. He poured the hot water into a metal cup and pressed it into her hands. She looked at him, eyes glassy but alert, and said, "Thank you." He nodded, watching the shadows dance across her cheeks. When the fire crackled stronger and her fingers found color again, she looked at him with more than just gratitude. "You always come back," she said, almost like a question. Elijah stared into the fire. His voice was quiet. "Because nobody came back for me." Tessa looked down at the cup, then into the fire, and for the first time she scooted a little closer. She didn't lean on him, but she didn't pull away either. The rain slowed, the storm moved east, but in that moment, under a half-dead tree and a patch of sky, two broken lives sat shoulder to shoulder in silence. And something gentle, almost sacred, passed between them. The days that followed were quieter, but something between them had shifted. Tessa no longer stayed hidden when Elijah arrived. She met him by the fire pit now, already collecting twigs or drying leaves, sometimes humming softly under her breath. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. The silence between them had changed from cautious to calm. Elijah brought books, nothing fancy, just old paperbacks his wife used to keep on a shelf in the sewing room. Westerns mostly. Some pages were dog-eared, some torn, but the stories still lived. Tessa flipped through them slowly at first, unsure, then began reading aloud under her breath while the fire crackled nearby. Her voice was thin and rough from disuse, but steady. One afternoon, as they ate from a shared tin of beans, Elijah pointed to a word in the book and asked her what it meant. She answered without hesitation. He nodded and pretended to look surprised. She smirked just a little, but it was the closest he had seen to a smile on her face. "You ever been to school?" he asked gently. "Sometimes," she replied, eyes still on the fire. "Never stayed long." Elijah didn't push further. Instead, he leaned back and looked at the clouds drifting over the hills. "You're smart," he said. "Got a good head, sharp." She didn't respond, but her hands moved more confidently after that. In the following weeks, she shared fragments of her past, not all at once, but in moments like leaves carried by wind. She had lived with distant relatives on the edge of the reservation. It hadn't been safe. No one had protected her. When she ran without a plan. She'd rather be cold and free than warm and afraid. Elijah listened, always without judgment. Sometimes he'd nod. Sometimes he'd toss another log on the fire, letting the crackle fill the space where pain lingered. But he never asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. One evening she brought something of her own, a small pouch made from worn canvas, tied with string. Inside was a carved stone, shaped like a bear. She placed it between them without a word. Elijah looked at it, then at her. "It's yours." Tessa nodded. Was my brother's before he left. He reached out and gently pushed it back toward her. You keep it, that kind of thing shouldn't be left behind. But she didn't take it back, she left it there on the log when she stood to go. Elijah watched her disappear into the dark, the firelight catching on her braid as it swayed behind her. He picked up the stone and held it for a long time. By the next morning he had built a small box for it, lined with soft cloth, and left it beside the kettle. When Tessa found it, she said nothing, but she placed the box carefully in her shelter, right beside her sleeping blanket. That night, as the fire warmed their faces and the stars blinked open above them, she finally said, "You don't treat me like I'm broken." Elijah stirred the fire. "You're not," he said plainly. "You've just been around people who didn't know what they were looking at." For the first time, Tessa smiled fully. Not a smirk, not a twitch, a real, wide, fragile smile. And Elijah, who hadn't smiled like that in years, smiled back. The air was different that morning, not just colder, more alert, like something had shifted in the wind. Tessa noticed it first. She was gathering dry grass near the edge of the creek bed when she saw a truck parked near the service road. It was Elijah's. It was newer, white, with a government plate on the back bumper. The engine was still warm. Someone was asking questions. She dropped the grass and moved back into the trees, silent and fast, her breath caught in her chest. Inside the diner at the edge of town, a social worker named Carla Jennings sipped from a chipped mug and read through a manila folder. She had been following reports for weeks, vague sightings, second-hand rumors, a few statements from locals about a girl who fit a description. A missing minor, no official records, no formal guardianship. She wasn't trying to arrest anyone. She just wanted to make sure the girl was alive and safe. Elijah had seen the truck too. He passed by the diner slowly, the brim of his hat pulled low. When he saw the woman at the window, he knew, not who she was exactly, but what she represented, something official, something that could end everything too fast. That evening he arrived later than usual. Tessa was already seated near the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't look up when he sat down. "There was a woman in town," she said, "asking about me." He nodded slowly. "I saw her." Tessa's voice was quiet. "You going to turn me in?" "No," Elijah said without hesitation. Then after a pause, "But she'll keep looking." She turned her face away toward the darkness. "They'll send me back." Elijah didn't speak for a long time. The fire popped and shifted beside them. "I'm not a criminal," she said. "I just wanted to be somewhere, not dangerous." "I know," he said. She finally looked at him. "But the law doesn't care about that, right?" He exhaled deeply. "Sometimes it cares about paper more than people, but that doesn't mean it's always wrong." Her eyes narrowed. "You want me to leave?" "No," his voice was firm now. "I want you to be safe. That's not the same thing." Tessa stood up abruptly, the old blanket slipping off her shoulders. "You don't get to decide what's safe for me. I already did that when I ran." Elijah stood too, calm but serious. "I'm not here to trap you, but we have to think if she finds this place." "She won't," Tessa interrupted, "because I'm leaving." The words hit Elijah harder than he expected. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He watched as she packed the few items she had: blanket, cup, the little wooden box with the carved bear inside. She didn't say goodbye. She just walked into the night. Elijah didn't sleep. He sat by the fire until the sun rose, watching the path she had taken disappear into shadow. He had told himself he wouldn't get attached, that helping her was about decency, not connection. But now, in the echo of her absence, he felt something hollow and old come roaring back. The silence was louder than ever. Elijah searched for her the next day. He rode the perimeter of his land twice, then ventured beyond the fence line, past the creek bed and toward the canyon edge. No tracks, no sign. He checked the old bus station, the burned-out trailer lot, even the shelter behind the church, though he knew deep down she wouldn't go anywhere people could ask questions. By the third day, he couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. His chest ached in a way he hadn't felt since the night his wife passed. This wasn't just concern anymore, it was grief. He returned to the fire pit each morning and evening, placing a tin of food or a folded note by the stones, hoping she might come back and see. Each time, the items remained untouched. Then on the fifth day, just as the light began to dim behind the hills, Elijah found her. She was curled beneath a broken fence post on the far side of the dry arroyo, her skin pale, her lips cracked. Her eyes barely opened when he called her name. The carved bear was still clutched in her hand. "Tessa, hey," he whispered, kneeling beside her. She tried to sit up but collapsed into his arms. He didn't wait, he wrapped her in his coat, lifted her gently, and carried her to his truck. The ride to town was rough, the tires kicking up dust and gravel as he sped down the unpaved road. At the clinic, the nurse asked too many questions. Elijah answered what he could, said she was under his care now and that she'd been staying out near his land. The nurse raised an eyebrow but said nothing more after he offered his name. In this town, people remembered kindness. Elijah Knox had built fences and repaired roofs long before grief took his voice. Tessa slept for nearly 2 days. When she woke, her throat was dry and her body sore, but the worst had passed. Elijah was there, sitting in the hard plastic chair beside her bed, a book in his lap. The carved bear sat on the table beside her water cup. "You found me," she said hoarsely. "I said I'd come back," Elijah replied softly. A knock came at the door. Carla Jennings stepped in, folder in hand, her face kind but firm. "Hi, Tessa," she said gently. "I've been looking for you." Tessa stiffened. Elijah stood, placing himself slightly between them. Carla raised both hands. "I'm not here to take her away. I'm here to help if you'll let me." Tessa's voice wavered. "They always say that." Carla sat down. "I can get you placed with someone who listens, someone like Elijah, but legally, so you don't have to hide anymore, so you don't have to run." Elijah didn't speak. He let Tessa decide. She looked from Carla to Elijah. Her eyes were tired but clear. "I want to stay," she said, "but not in the dark, not anymore." Carla nodded slowly. "Then let's figure that out together." By the end of the week, arrangements were underway. Temporary guardianship, a social case opened, medical clearance signed. Nothing was guaranteed, but for the first time the system wasn't a threat, it was a bridge. That night back at the ranch, Tessa stood by the fire again. The kettle steamed gently, and the carved bear rested beside it, clean and dry. She looked at Elijah. "You still want company?" He smiled, soft and certain. "I've been waiting for it." Tessa didn't return to the shelter again. Instead, she moved into the small room Elijah had cleared months earlier, the one with faded lavender curtains and dust on every shelf. Together, they cleaned it slowly, neither in a rush. Tessa chose to keep the old sewing machine in the corner, even though it didn't work. "It smells like something good used to happen here," she said. She started attending school in town, just part-time at first. Carla helped with the paperwork, and Elijah signed what needed to be signed without hesitation. On her first day, he drove her in his beat-up truck, both of them pretending it was just a regular Monday. She wore the second-hand boots he had polished the night before, and she carried her books in a backpack she'd chosen from the donation shelf at the clinic. When she walked through the school gates, she turned back once and caught him watching. "Don't get soft on me," she joked, the corner of her mouth pulling up. "Too late," Elijah muttered, but she saw the smile. After school, she'd come home and help with chores around the ranch, feeding the chickens, checking the fencing, sweeping the porch. Elijah gave her space to learn, and she gave him something he didn't know he missed: noise. There was humming again in the kitchen, books scattered on tables. The old radio played music in the afternoons. Sometimes they'd sit by the fire pit where it all began. She still used the kettle, still watched it steam before speaking. But now, the silence between them was full of things said and unsaid, understood without being spoken. One evening, as they sat beneath a sky heavy with stars, Tessa turned to him. "You don't treat me like a case," she said, "like I'm temporary." Elijah stared into the flames. "You're not." She didn't reply, but she leaned her head slightly onto his shoulder. It was the first time she'd ever touched him by choice. His body went still for a moment, then relaxed. He didn't say anything. He just let her be there. That night, she added something to the shelf in her room. A small framed photo Carla had taken of her beside the ranch fence, smiling with her hair tied back. Next to it, she placed the carved bear. The next morning, she woke before sunrise and made coffee for both of them. Elijah blinked in surprise when she handed him the mug. "You're trying to steal my job," he joked. "No," she said, grinning. "I'm just practicing for when this place is mine." He raised an eyebrow, pretending to be scandalized, already planning a takeover. Tessa sipped her coffee. "Someday, maybe." He didn't answer, just smiled into his mug. The ranch wasn't perfect. There were still bills to pay, things to fix, scars that showed up when the nights got too quiet. But it was real, it was safe, it was hers as much as it was his. And for the first time in both their lives, the word home didn't feel like a lie. The evening was warm, the kind of warmth that only came after months of healing, slow, honest, and earned. The sun melted behind the distant hills as soft orange light spilled across the ranch. Tessa sat on the porch steps, barefoot, the carved bear resting beside her. Inside the house, a simple dinner simmered, beans, cornbread, and sweet tea cooling on the counter. Elijah was fixing the hinge on the barn door, but his eyes kept drifting back toward the house. It had become a habit, this quiet watching, not out of worry anymore, but pride, the kind of pride that made a man stand taller without realizing it. Tessa stood and walked to the fire pit. She moved with purpose, stacking the kindling, placing the smooth stones just the way he had taught her. She poured water into the kettle and set it over the flame, just as he had done on that first morning. Elijah joined her, his boots crunching softly over gravel. "You've gotten good at that," he said. She smiled, "Had a decent teacher." They sat beside each other in silence, the fire crackling gently between them. The kettle began to whistle low, steam curling into the air. Tessa didn't speak right away. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes watching the flames. Then with a soft voice, steady, sure, she said, "You know, I used to think I wasn't meant to stay anywhere, like I'd always be the one passing through." Elijah glanced at her but didn't interrupt. "But now," she turned to face him, "now I think maybe I was just waiting for the right place to land." He nodded slowly. "Not everyone finds that place." "I did," she said, then she added, quieter, "and I found the person who made it possible." Elijah's throat tightened, but he didn't look away. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a form Carla had given her, a request to make the guardianship permanent. She handed it to him. "You can read it later," she said, "but I already signed it." Elijah stared at the paper, then at her. And then she said the word that unlatched something deep inside him. "Dad." He didn't answer, just closed his eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. Later, as they ate under the porch light, laughter came easy. Tessa told a story about a chicken that had chased her earlier that day, and Elijah nearly choked on his tea. The house, once silent and still, now echoed with life. And that night before bed, she placed the carved bear on the windowsill, facing the fire pit. She turned off the light, but left the window open so the warmth from the flames could drift in. She no longer needed to run. She no longer needed to hide. She had found peace. She had found a home. She had found someone who stayed.